In the heart of Africa's untamed wilderness, where the Luangwa River carves through the Zambian landscape like a serpent of life and death, there exists a story so terrifying that it continues to haunt the memories of those who lived through it and captivates millions who hear it today. This is not a fictional tale crafted for entertainment, nor is it an exaggerated legend passed down through generations. This is the documented, verified, and utterly bone-chilling account of the Mfue man-eater, a solitary male lion that transformed from nature's magnificent apex predator into something far more sinister, a calculated killer that specifically targeted human beings with a methodical precision that defied everything wildlife experts thought they knew about lion behavior. What you are about to discover will challenge your understanding of the natural world, make you question the thin line between civilization and the wild, and reveal why this particular lion became one of the most infamous man-eaters in recorded history, a beast whose preserved body now stands as a silent testament to terror in one of America's most prestigious museums, watched by thousands of visitors who have no idea of the true horror behind those glass eyes. The year was 1991, and the Luangwa Valley was experiencing what locals thought would be another typical dry season. But fate had something completely different in store for the inhabitants of a small, remote village near the Mfue area, where life moved at the rhythm of the African bush, and people lived in harmony with the dangerous wildlife that surrounded them, understanding the unspoken rules of coexistence that had kept their communities safe for generations. But this lion, this particular male with his distinctive scarred face and powerful build, had already made a decision that would shatter that ancient balance forever, driven by circumstances that researchers and wildlife behaviorists would debate for decades to come, trying to understand what transforms a wild animal into a deliberate hunter of humans, crossing that forbidden threshold that separates natural predation from calculated murder. The first attack came without warning, shattering the evening peace with screams that would echo through the valley and mark the beginning of a reign of terror that would last months. A woman was taken from her hut in the dead of night, dragged into the darkness by powerful jaws that crushed through the traditional mud walls as if they were paper, leaving behind only bloodstains and the horrified witnesses who could do nothing but watch in paralyzed fear as one of their own disappeared into the bush, her cries fading into the African night. The villagers immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong, because this was not normal lion behavior, not the opportunistic attack of a starving animal or the defensive strike of a cornered predator, but something far more deliberate and terrifying. Lions typically avoid human settlements, their natural wariness of people keeping them at a respectful distance even when hunger drives them close to livestock. But this male showed no such hesitation, no fear, only a focused determination that suggested he had already made humans his preferred prey. Within days, he struck again, this time taking a man who was sleeping outside his dwelling, seeking relief from the oppressive heat that makes Zambian nights feel like you're breathing through wet cloth. The pattern was establishing itself with horrifying clarity. This lion was not randomly attacking out of desperation or confusion. He was hunting humans with the same strategic intelligence that lions typically reserve for buffalo and zebra, studying their habits, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, and exploiting them with the calculated patience of an experienced killer. The third victim was a young person caught between childhood and adulthood, someone with dreams and a future that was violently erased in moments, dragged from the supposed safety of their home while family members could only scream helplessly, their traditional weapons useless against an adversary that moved with supernatural speed and possessed strength that seemed beyond that of a normal lion. The community was descending into chaos as fear replaced the normal rhythms of daily life. People refused to leave their homes after dark, children were kept inside even during daylight hours, and the collective psychological trauma was manifesting in ways that would scar the survivors forever, creating a climate of terror that outsiders could barely comprehend. The Zambian authorities were notified, wildlife officials were dispatched to assess the situation, and local hunters began organizing patrols, but the lion seemed to possess an almost preternatural ability to evade detection, disappearing into the vast wilderness like a ghost whenever search parties ventured out, only to reappear when vigilance inevitably waned and strike again with devastating efficiency. The fourth attack demonstrated the lion's growing boldness and his complete lack of fear regarding human presence, as he entered a dwelling where multiple people were sleeping and selectively chose his victim with a precision that suggested intelligence bordering on the uncanny, dragging the person out while others lay frozen in terror just meters away. Survivors who would spend the rest of their lives wondering why they were spared and tormented by guilt that they could not prevent what happened. By this point, the story had spread throughout the region, drawing attention from wildlife experts, government officials, and international media, all trying to understand what had created this monster and how to stop it before the body count climbed higher. The lion had by now claimed 4 lives, 4 human beings with families, dreams, and communities that mourned them, and the psychological impact was radiating far beyond the immediate area, affecting tourism, local economies, and the relationship between humans and wildlife across the entire Luangwa Valley. The 5th and 6th victims came in rapid succession, as if the lion had reached some kind of psychological threshold where human hunting had become not just accepted but preferred. His technique refined through practice, his confidence absolute, his reign of terror seemingly unstoppable by conventional means. Witnesses described a massive male lion with distinctive features, scars that told stories of past battles, a particular way of moving that combined power with stealth, and eyes that seemed to reflect not animal instinct, but something closer to cold calculation, a predator that had crossed into territory that science struggles to explain and that challenges our comfortable assumptions about animal behavior and motivation. The community was past the point of panic and had entered a state of traumatized resignation, where people understood that traditional methods had failed, that their ancestors' knowledge of dealing with problem animals was insufficient against this particular threat, and that outside intervention was not just desired but desperately needed if anyone was going to survive whatever dark purpose was driving this solitary male to continue his systematic predation on human beings. The psychological profile emerging from survivor testimonies painted a picture of an animal that had somehow learned to see humans not as the dangerous tool-using species that normally commands respect from wildlife, but as relatively easy prey that could be taken with minimal risk. A cognitive shift that represents one of the most disturbing intersections of human and animal psychology ever documented in wildlife management records. Enter Wayne Hosek, an American hunter whose name would become forever linked with this tragedy, a man who would travel from the United States to the heart of Africa, carrying the weight of 6 deaths and the desperate hopes of an entire community on his shoulders, understanding that failure was not an option and that he was engaging not in sport hunting but in a grim necessity that would require every bit of his skill, experience, and mental fortitude to successfully complete. Hosek was not some trophy hunter seeking glory or looking to add an impressive specimen to his collection. He was a professional who understood the gravity of the situation and the moral complexity of what he was being asked to do, tracking and killing an animal that was simply following instincts that had somehow been perverted by circumstances that researchers would debate for years, trying to understand whether injury, age, dental problems, or some combination of factors had pushed this particular lion across the line into dedicated dedicated man-eating behavior. The hunt that followed was not the romanticized adventure that popular media often portrays, but a tense, exhausting, and psychologically draining pursuit through some of Africa's most challenging terrain, where Hosek had to think like the lion, anticipate his movements, understand his patterns, and ultimately confront him in a moment that would be simultaneously triumph and tragedy, the ending of a threat, but also the killing of a magnificent creature that represented everything powerful and beautiful about African wildlife, even as his actions had become monstrous and unacceptable. The tracking process revealed just how intelligent and adaptive this lion had become, how he used the landscape to his advantage, how he timed his movements to avoid detection, how he had learned to distinguish between armed search parties and vulnerable targets, demonstrating cognitive abilities that went far beyond simple instinct and suggested a level of learning and problem-solving that made him even more dangerous than initially understood. Hosek spent days in the bush, following tracks, interviewing witnesses, studying attack patterns, and slowly building a picture of his adversary that would allow him to predict where and when the next opportunity might arise. Knowing that the lion's confidence had grown to the point where he would certainly strike again, if not stopped, and that every hour of delay potentially meant another human life lost to this predator's insatiable appetite. The physical demands of the hunt were compounded by the psychological pressure of knowing that an entire community was depending on success, that failure would mean continued terror and possibly more deaths, and that the weight of responsibility for ending this nightmare rested solely on Hosek's abilities as a hunter and his willingness to enter into a deadly game of cat and mouse where he might become the prey rather than the predator if he made even a single miscalculation. The confrontation, when it finally came, was both anticlimactic and intensely dramatic, a moment of violence that ended months of terror in seconds, but left behind questions that would persist far longer than the echo of the fatal shot. Questions about what drives animals to cross boundaries that evolution has programmed them to respect. Questions about human encroachment on wildlife habitat. Questions about the nature of predation and whether we can truly understand the minds of the animals we share this planet with when they begin exhibiting behaviors that seem to transcend instinct and approach something closer to deliberate choice. The aftermath of the hunt brought not relief, but a complex mixture of emotions for everyone involved. As the massive body of the Mfue man-eater lay cooling in the African sun, his reign of terror ended, but the trauma he inflicted remaining fresh in the minds of survivors who would carry psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Children who would grow up with nightmares, families forever incomplete, and a community that would need years to rebuild the sense of security that had been shattered during those horrific months of 1991. Wayne Hosek stood over the carcass with feelings that mixed professional satisfaction at a job completed with genuine sadness at having to kill such a magnificent example of one of Africa's most iconic species, understanding that this was not a villain to be celebrated in death, but a tragedy that revealed the increasingly complex and often destructive relationship between human expansion and wildlife habitat, a collision of worlds that produces casualties on both sides and raises questions that have no easy answers. The physical examination of the lion's body provided some clues to his behavior, but no definitive explanation for why this particular animal had become such an efficient and dedicated man-eater. As veterinary experts and wildlife biologists conducted detailed analysis looking for injuries, dental problems, diseases, or physical limitations that might have made hunting traditional prey difficult and pushed him toward easier human targets. But while they found evidence of age and some wear that comes with life in the wild, nothing clearly explained the dramatic behavioral shift that had made him one of the most prolific man-eaters in modern African history. The decision to preserve the lion's body and send it to the Field Museum in Chicago was met with mixed reactions, some seeing it as appropriate memorialization that would educate future generations about the complex relationship between humans and predators, while others felt it was macabre trophy-taking that disrespected both the victim victims and the animal itself, turning tragedy into spectacle for the entertainment of museum visitors who would never understand the true horror of what this creature represented to the people of Mfue. The taxidermy process transformed the dead predator into a permanent exhibit, his body mounted in a lifelike pose that captures the power and majesty of a male lion in his prime, standing eternal watch in the museum's halls where millions of visitors have passed by over the decades, most taking photos and admiring the impressive size and beauty of the specimen without reading the placard that tells the darker story of 6 human lives ended, a community traumatized, and the complex questions that his existence raises about coexistence, conservation, and what happens when the boundaries between human and animal territories become increasingly blurred. The Mfue man-eater has become something of a legend in wildlife management circles, studied by researchers trying to understand man-eating behavior, referenced in academic papers exploring human-wildlife conflict, and discussed in ethical debates about hunting, conservation, and how society should respond when wild animals become threats to human life, questions that become more urgent as human populations expand into formerly wild areas and animals find themselves with shrinking habitat and increasing contact with the species that has come to dominate virtually every ecosystem on Earth. The story raises profound questions about what we owe to both human communities and wildlife populations, about how we balance conservation goals with human safety, about whether problem animals can be rehabilitated or relocated, or whether lethal removal is sometimes the only viable option, and about what drives certain individual animals to cross boundaries that their species typically respects, becoming aberrations that challenge our understanding of animal behavior and force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the natural world and our place within it. Some researchers have theorized that the Mfue lion may have initially tasted human flesh through scavenging, perhaps finding the body of someone who died of natural causes or accident, and that experience triggered something in his brain that made him recognize humans as potential prey rather than threats to be avoided, a cognitive shift that once made is difficult or impossible to reverse, turning a normal wild animal into a dedicated man-eater that will continue killing humans until stopped by death or capture. Others suggest that injuries or dental problems that weren't apparent in the post-mortem examination may have made traditional hunting too difficult or painful, pushing him towards slower, less dangerous prey, and that humans simply represented the path of least resistance for an animal that needed to eat but could no longer hunt effectively in traditional ways. Still, other theories point to the displacement of prey animals through habitat loss, suggesting that as human agricultural and settlement activities pushed traditional prey species out of their ranges, predators like lions found themselves in territories where the most abundant large mammals were humans and their livestock, creating situations where conflict was inevitable, and some individual animals would inevitably learn to exploit these new food sources. The psychological impact on the Mfue community extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, creating generational trauma that would affect how children grew up, how people related to the natural world around them, and how the entire region approached wildlife management and conservation in the decades that followed, with some advocating for more aggressive control of predator populations, while others pushed for better education and protective measures that would allow humans and wildlife to coexist without the tragic outcomes that occurred in 1991. The 6 victims of the Mfue man-eater were individuals with names and stories, people who were loved and are still mourned, but their identities have often been lost in the retelling of this story, reduced to numbers in a body count rather than recognized as the human beings they were, with dreams, relationships, roles in their community, and futures that were violently cut short by circumstances beyond their control, killed by an animal that under different conditions they might have lived. Their entire lives alongside, without incident, The families left behind struggled with grief compounded by the traumatic nature of the deaths, the knowledge that their loved ones died in terror and pain, the inability to prevent what happened despite being so close, and the psychological burden of continuing to live in an area where such tragedy occurred, where every sound in the night might trigger memories, and where the boundary between safety and danger had been proven terrifyingly permeable. Wayne Hosek returned to America carrying the weight of what he had done, the knowledge that he had saved lives by ending a threat, but also that he had killed a magnificent animal that in a different context deserved protection and respect, a moral complexity that trophy hunters and sport enthusiasts often ignore, but that Hosek understood clearly, recognizing that there were no winners in this situation, only varying degrees of loss and the grim satisfaction of having prevented future tragedies. At the cost of ending a life that represented millions of years of evolution and the peak of predatory adaptation. His role in the story has been both praised and criticized, with some viewing him as a hero who responded to a desperate community's need, while others see him as a representative of colonial attitudes toward African wildlife, a foreign hunter coming to kill animals in someone else's country, though this criticism often ignores the fact that he was specifically requested by authorities who had exhausted local options and were facing a crisis that required immediate resolution regardless of the nationality of the person who provided it. The hunt itself has been analyzed and reanalyzed by subsequent generations of wildlife managers and hunters, studied for what it reveals about tracking techniques, animal behavior under pressure, and the psychological demands of pursuing a man-eater, an animal that has proven itself capable of killing humans and therefore represents a threat level exponentially higher than normal game hunting, where the worst outcome is usually a wounded animal, not a predator that might turn the tables and make the hunter into prey. The Field Museum exhibit has educated millions about lions, about African wildlife, about man-eating behavior, and about the complex relationships between humans and predators, though whether this education honors or exploits the tragedy behind the specimen is a question each visitor must answer for themselves, as they stand before the impressive mounted lion and read about the 6 people he killed, perhaps feeling a thrill of danger from the safety of the museum floor, perhaps contemplating the deeper questions about coexistence and conflict, or perhaps simply taking a selfie with an impressive taxidermy specimen and moving on to the next exhibit without fully processing the horror and complexity that this particular animal represents. The scientific value of the specimen has been considerable, as researchers have been able to study the physical characteristics of a confirmed man-eater, comparing his build, skull structure, tooth wear, and other features with those of normal lions to search for physical markers that might predict or explain man-eating behavior, though decades of study have failed to produce any reliable indicators that would allow managers to identify potential man-eaters before they begin killing, leaving us with the uncomfortable reality that any large predator under the right circumstances might make the transition from hunting natural prey to targeting humans. The genetic material preserved in the specimen has also contributed to broader understanding of lion population genetics, as DNA analysis has revealed information about the Luangwa Valley lion population and how it relates to other populations across Africa, providing data that informs current conservation efforts, even as the story of this particular lion serves as a cautionary tale about what can happen when conservation and human safety come into direct conflict. The legacy of the Mfui man-eater extends far beyond the 6 lives he took and the community he terrorized, influencing wildlife policy throughout Africa, shaping how authorities respond to problem animals, informing the development of early warning systems and rapid response protocols designed to prevent similar situations, and contributing to ongoing debates about hunting, conservation, human rights, and animal rights that become more complex as our planet becomes more crowded and wild spaces. become increasingly fragmented and pressured by human activity. The story has been told and retold in various forms, appearing in books about man-eaters, documentary programs about dangerous animals, wildlife management textbooks, and now in museums where the actual perpetrator stands preserved for eternity. His story reduced to a placard, but his impact resonating through the decades since that fateful year when he decided that humans were prey and set about proving it with a systematic efficiency that still chills those who study the case. For the people of Mafue and the surrounding areas, the memory remains vivid even 30+ years later, a reminder that the wild is still wild despite our best efforts to control and manage it, that predators are still predators regardless of conservation status, and that the price of living alongside some of Earth's most magnificent creatures sometimes includes tragedy that no amount of preparation or caution can completely prevent. The 6 victims deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a wildlife management case study, but as individuals who paid the ultimate price for circumstances they did not create and could not control, killed by an animal that was following corrupted instincts in a world where humans and wildlife are forced into proximity that nature never intended, creating situations where conflict is inevitable and casualties occur on both sides of the divide between civilization and wilderness, between the world we have built and the world that existed before we came to dominate it so completely.